at 37. Mara Ellison was unemployed, watching her savings disappear and beginning to wonder how many more months she could keep pretending everything was under control. When a mineral company called about the strangest inheritance she had ever received. 18 years earlier, when Mara was only 19, her grandfather Samuel had died and left her no house, no farmland, and no useful piece of property she could actually live on or sell easily. Instead, he had given her the mineral rights beneath 312 acres of somebody else's farm. Mara remembered sitting in the attorney's office and asking, "So I own the land?" The answer was almost embarrassing. No. The Pike family owned the surface. They had the fields, the farmhouse, the roads, and everything Mara could actually see. She owned certain rights beneath their feet. At 19, she thought it was ridiculous. Her mother wanted nothing to do with Samuel's old maps and property disputes, and even Mara eventually treated the inheritance like one more example of her grandfather caring too much about things that no longer mattered. For 18 years, those rights produced almost nothing. Then, at the worst financial moment of Mara's adult life, Harrow Ridge Resources offered to buy them for enough money to change everything. People around her saw an obvious answer. Sell. Take the money. Stop worrying about an inheritance buried beneath land she did not own. Even the idea of spending money on an independent survey before accepting the offer seemed absurd. Why investigate something a company was already willing to pay for? But while Mara searched through the original inheritance papers, she found a handwritten warning from Samuel that she had forgotten existed. Do not transfer the lower rights until the Vale survey is compared. There was only one problem. Mara had never heard of the Vale survey. Modern property maps showed nothing by that name. When she contacted land surveyor Daniel Rourke, he found something even stranger. The legal description of Mara's underground rights referenced boundary markers that no longer existed, including a place called Vale School Corner. There was no Vale School on Pike Farm. There was no Vale School on any current county map. Mara could have dismissed it as outdated paperwork, taken the money, and walked away. Instead, she ordered the survey her grandfather's warning seemed to demand. What came back changed the meaning of her inheritance completely. Beneath the fields of someone else's farm, the instruments detected straight structural patterns where natural geology should have been irregular buried foundation lines. Filled spaces, sealed passages, and old underground features arranged in a pattern that looked disturbingly deliberate. Daniel overlaid the new results with a damaged historical map Samuel had spent years trying to preserve. Mara watched the lines settle over one another. A schoolhouse matched one anomaly. A row of old homes matched another. Roads that had vanished from every modern map suddenly appeared beneath the farm, and across the center of Samuel's old survey was the name of a settlement Mara had never been told her own family came from. Vale Hollow. That was when Mara realized her grandfather might never have left her those mineral rights because of what could be extracted from the ground. He may have left them because of what someone had tried to erase from it. And when Mara discovered why an entire community had disappeared from the maps and what Samuel had quietly spent decades buying back one tiny underground right at a time, the inheritance everyone thought was worthless became something far more complicated than money. But before we uncover what the survey found beneath Pike Farm, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. Whether you're listening early in the morning, late at night, or somewhere in between, wherever you are, I hope you're having a peaceful day. And I wish you a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening ahead. And if you enjoy emotional inheritance stories about forgotten land, hidden family history, and discoveries that change everything people thought they knew, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Now, let's go back to Mara, because the first clue her grandfather left behind wasn't buried underground at all. It was written into an 18-year-old deed, and one missing place name was about to prove that someone else's farm had once been an entire town. Mara Ellison was halfway through calculating how long her savings would last when her phone rang. She had been unemployed for 23 days. The architectural drafting company where she had worked for nearly 9 years had closed with less than a month's warning, leaving Mara with a final paycheck, a modest severance, and the uncomfortable discovery that 37 was a difficult age to begin again. Her laptop displayed 3 job listings she had already applied for. Beside it sat an electric bill she had not yet paid. "Mara Ellison?" the caller asked. "Speaking. My name is Colin Mercer. I'm calling regarding mineral interests you own in Bellwether County." Mara almost ended the call. "I'm not interested in buying anything. We're interested in buying from you." That stopped her. "What exactly your mineral rights beneath the Pike property?" Mara leaned back. She had not thought seriously about those rights in years. "How did you get my number? Property ownership records? I represent Harrow Ridge Resources. We're acquiring mineral interests in that area." He gave her a preliminary figure. Mara asked him to repeat it. The second time sounded just as impossible. "For rights under land I don't own?" "Correct. And I can sell them, subject to title verification." "Yes. We'd send a formal proposal." Mara looked at the unpaid bill. "Send it." After the call, she remained motionless at the kitchen table. 18 years earlier, another table had separated Mara from an attorney explaining those same rights. She had been 19 then, still carrying a college catalog in her backpack and expecting her grandfather's estate meeting to last 20 minutes. Samuel Vale had not been wealthy. Mara thought she might receive his old truck, perhaps some books, maybe a few $1,000s if he had saved more than anyone knew. Instead, the attorney had unfolded a property description and said, "Your grandfather left you his consolidated mineral interests beneath approximately 312 acres in Bellwether County." 19-year-old Mara had blinked. "So I own land?" "No." "Then what did you just say I inherited?" Her mother Helen sat beside her looking tired rather than surprised. The attorney explained that surface ownership and mineral ownership could be legally separate. The Pike family owned the farm above. Samuel had accumulated certain rights beneath it through inheritance and later transactions. Those interests now passed to Mara. "Can I build something there?" she asked. "Not by virtue of these rights." "Can I live there?" "No." "Can I farm it?" "No." Mara looked at Helen. "So Grandpa left me property I can't stand on." Helen gave a small sigh. "Your grandfather collected deeds the way other people collected stamps. Why give it to me?" The attorney had no answer beyond Samuel's will. Helen offered one in the parking lot afterward. "Because your grandfather believed old land papers mattered more than they did." Mara remembered laughing then. Partly because the alternative was admitting disappointment. Samuel had always been kind to her, if peculiar. He kept rolled maps in closets and deed copies in labeled boxes when Mara visited. He could turn a 10-minute drive into an explanation of who had owned every ridge 50 years earlier. At 19, she had wanted a future, not a history lesson. The mineral right documents went into a file box. College followed, work followed. Marriage never did. Though several relationships came and went, Samuel's inheritance remained mostly silent. There were occasional tax notices, title inquiries, and letters from companies offering amounts too small to interest her. Eventually, Mara stopped thinking of the rights as an inheritance at all. Now Harrow Ridge's preliminary offer was larger than her remaining annual salary had been. The formal proposal arrived by email that afternoon. Mara printed it because numbers felt more real on paper. Even after reading the conditions, she kept returning to the purchase amount. It could buy time, Not luxury, time. Enough to search for the right job instead of the first one. Enough to stop calculating groceries against utilities. Enough to breathe. She called Helen. "Do you remember Grandpa's mineral rights?" Silence answered first. "Unfortunately, a company wants to buy them." "Then sell them?" Mara smiled faintly. "You don't want to know the offer. Are you asking whether Samuel would approve?" "No." "Good, because Samuel is not the one paying your bills." Mara heard the old irritation beneath her mother's voice. "You really hated those papers. I hated what they did to him. Every old boundary became something he had to solve. The company's offering real money. Then perhaps he finally did you a favor." Mara looked at the proposal. "That sounds harsh." Helen softened. "I loved my father. That doesn't mean I understood him." After they hung up, Mara emailed Harrow Ridge requesting the title documents they wanted her to sign. Then she went to the hall closet. Samuel's estate papers were somewhere behind old drafting portfolios and 2 boxes she had not opened since moving into the apartment. She found the file container beneath a broken desk lamp. Dust coated the lid. Inside were tax records, correspondence, copies of deeds, and the original estate packet. Mara carried everything to the kitchen table. The mineral deed was denser than she remembered, filled with descriptions that meant little without a map. She searched for restrictions that might complicate a sale. Nothing obvious appeared. Beneath the deed lay a yellowed envelope marked Mineral Interest Mara. The handwriting was Samuel's. Mara paused. She remembered the envelope, but not what was inside. It contained several photocopied plats, a list of parcel numbers, and a folded sheet of paper covered with Samuel's notes. Most concerned names and dates she did not recognize. At the bottom, he had written Mara's name and underlined it once. She read the sentence beneath it. Then she read it again. Samuel had known the rights might someday be transferred. He had left one specific instruction before that happened. Mara pulled the Harrow Ridge offer closer and compared it with the old papers. Suddenly less eager to sign anything. The warning was only 11 words long, but one phrase meant nothing to her. She searched the estate packet for another document carrying the same name. There was none. She checked the plats. Nothing. She even searched online, expecting to find a county survey record. No obvious result appeared. Mara looked again at Samuel's handwriting. For 18 years, she had believed he had left her an inconvenient fragment of somebody else's property. Now, just when that fragment had become valuable enough to sell, her grandfather's forgotten instruction stood between Mara and the money. Do not transfer the lower rights until the Vale survey is compared. Mara waited 2 days before calling anyone about Samuel's warning. Part of her resented the delay. Harrow Ridge had sent follow-up paperwork, and every hour she spent investigating an 18-year-old note felt like another hour allowing her grandfather's obsession with land records to interfere with her life. Still, she could not sign. On Thursday morning, she drove into Bellwether County with Samuel's estate packet on the passenger seat. The landscape became familiar, gradually wooded ridges, narrow roads following creek beds, old houses set close to the pavement, and occasional abandoned industrial buildings disappearing beneath vines. Mara had not visited regularly since Samuel died. She remembered the county less as home than as somewhere her mother had been determined to leave. Pike Family Farm lay several miles outside the nearest town. Mara had never been there. She stopped beside a mailbox bearing the name Pike and checked the property map Harrow Ridge had sent. A gravel lane crossed a broad pasture before climbing toward a white farmhouse. She had called ahead because the mineral deed did not give her unlimited permission to enter the surface property, and she had no intention of beginning with trespassing. A man was repairing wire fencing near a barn when she parked. He straightened as she approached. "Mara Ellison?" "Yes." "Owen Pike." They shook hands. Owen was about her age, dressed in work boots and a faded canvas jacket. His expression was polite but guarded. "You said this was about mineral rights? My grandfather left me rights beneath part of your property. I know who owns them." That surprised her. "You knew my name?" "I knew Samuel Vale's. Your name replaced his in the records." Mara glanced across the pasture. "I honestly didn't know exactly where the rights were until this week." "Harrow Ridge knows." She looked back at him. "They contacted you. They asked about surface access." His tone sharpened. "That usually means they're talking to whoever owns what's underneath." Mara felt immediately defensive. "I haven't sold anything. Yet. I came here because I'm trying to understand what I own before I make a decision." Owen studied her for a moment. "What do you want from me? Right now?" "Permission for a surveyor to look at the property if necessary." "What kind of survey?" "I don't know yet." That answer did not help. Owen folded his arms. "My family runs cattle here. We've got wells, drainage, fences, access roads. Mineral development isn't something that happens in an invisible layer under our boots." "I understand. Do you?" Mara bristled. "I've owned these rights for 18 years and never done anything with them. That doesn't tell me what happens when somebody offers enough money." She almost told him the amount. Instead, she said, "I lost my job 3 weeks ago." Owen's expression changed slightly. "I'm sorry. So yes, the offer matters to me. But I'm standing here instead of signing it because my grandfather left an instruction I don't understand." She took a copy of Samuel's note from her folder. Owen read it. "Vale Survey. Have you heard of it?" "No. Neither have I." He handed the paper back. "Samuel came around here years ago." Mara stared at him. "Why, I was younger. My father dealt with him." Samuel asked about old property descriptions and boundary records. Dad thought he was chasing some ancient title issue. "Did he claim he owned the farm?" "No." Owen glanced toward the fields. He was interested in what was under it. That was enough to make Mara's unease return. "I'm hiring someone to look at the records first." "Nobody comes onto your land without arranging it with you." Owen nodded, but his expression remained serious. "I appreciate that." Mara started toward her car. "For what it's worth, I'm not trying to take your farm. I know you don't own the surface." "Then what are you worried about?" Owen looked across the pasture before answering. "You own what's under my farm. That means whatever you decide eventually reaches the surface." Mara had no response. Until that moment, she had treated the mineral rights as either useless paperwork or unexpected money. Owen had given them a third meaning: consequences. That afternoon, Mara met Daniel Rourke in a small surveying office near the county courthouse. He was 41, according to the professional listing she had found, and specialized in boundary work involving older deeds and subsurface interests. His office contained rolled plans, survey equipment, and shelves crowded with county map books. Mara placed Samuel's documents on his desk. "I need to know what the Vale Survey is." Daniel read Samuel's note without comment, then worked through the deed. "Your grandfather consolidated several interests. That's what the estate attorney told me." "Do you have the acquisition deeds?" "Some copies are probably in here." Daniel spent nearly 20 minutes arranging documents by date. "Before we worry about a missing survey, we need to establish what legal description Samuel was referencing. Can you do that?" "Probably. Quickly is another question." Mara thought of her savings. "What will it cost?" Daniel gave her an estimate for an initial records review. It was enough to hurt, but not enough to justify gambling the Harrow Ridge offer without understanding Samuel's warning. "Do it." Daniel pulled up current parcel maps for Pike Farm. The 312 acres were not a perfect match for Owen's entire surface holding, but the mineral description covered a substantial section. Daniel traced several calls from Samuel's deed against the modern map. His brow tightened. What Mara asked, the measurements aren't necessarily wrong. They're just not written from the modern parcel framework, meaning this description is following older reference points. He enlarged the map. Some of these monuments are gone. Monuments, boundary markers, trees, stones, roads, structures. Older deeds often use physical landmarks that later disappear. Mara understood that much from drafting work. A plan could remain technically interpretable long after the building it described had changed. Daniel opened a scanned deed index, then compared one line with Samuel's mineral description. Here, Mara leaned closer. The boundary ran from a creek crossing to an old stone marker, then north toward a named corner. "What's strange about that?" she asked. "I don't recognize the name." Daniel searched the current county mapping database. Nothing appeared. He tried a broader property record search. Again, nothing. Mara read the original description herself. Vale School Corner, yes. Was that a school? That would be the obvious interpretation. Is there one near Pike Farm? Daniel shook his head. Not now. Mara remembered Owen's pasture, the barn, the farmhouse, the open fields. Maybe it was demolished. Very possible. Then why does it matter? Daniel tapped the deed. Because your grandfather told you to compare a Vale survey, and the legal description of the rights he preserved uses a boundary point named after Vale. He pulled up another modern map and searched the surrounding roads. No school, no historic site marker, nothing named Vale. Mara looked down at Samuel's handwritten warning. She had driven into Bellwether County expecting an old survey to explain an inconvenient mineral deed. Instead, the deed itself had produced the first question. Somewhere beneath the legal description of someone else's farm was a reference to a place that no longer appeared on any current map, Vale School Corner. Daniel called Mara the following morning from the county records office. I found the older survey index. Mara sat up at her kitchen table. The Vale survey. Not exactly. I found references that might lead to it. Can you come down? An hour later, she found Daniel surrounded by deed books, photocopies, and 2 large county maps. He pointed to a survey recorded decades before the current Pike Farm boundaries had been assembled. This is where the problem starts. Mara leaned over the table. What problem? Nothing illegal. Just 2 different ways of describing the same ground. Daniel placed a transparent copy of the modern parcel map over an older boundary drawing. Pike Farm formed a recognizable block on the newer map. Beneath it, the older lines divided the same area differently. Your mineral estate follows these older calls, he said, not the later surface parcels. Mara studied the lines. Years of drafting work made the discrepancy immediately visible. That angle is wrong. Daniel looked at her. Which one? She pointed. If this boundary starts where the modern map says it does, that distance can't end at the creek crossing. Daniel measured it. Correct. He shifted the overlay slightly. Suddenly, the old measurements aligned. So the mineral description is based on something that predates the farm layout? That's my reading. Mara followed another line with her finger. And Vale School Corner still missing from current maps. Daniel opened a scanned survey book. But I found this. The page was badly faded. Several labels were unreadable. And part of the drawing had been damaged along one edge. Yet a road crossed the center, accompanied by small rectangular marks. Mara frowned. Are those buildings? Possibly. Surveyors sometimes mark structures as reference points. How old is this, Daniel? Gave her the approximate period. It was far older than the Pike Farm configuration. Mara searched for the school reference. Near the upper edge, a small rectangle carried a nearly illegible label. Daniel angled a desk lamp across the copy. 2 words became visible. Vale School. Mara felt a small chill. So it existed, at least on this survey. Then Samuel's deed wasn't using some imaginary landmark. No. Daniel moved another record beside it. And that isn't the interesting part. He had found a second historical plat referencing a road that no longer appeared on county maps. The road followed the hollow through what was now Pike Farm. Several property boundaries touched it, each much smaller than the modern farm acreage. Mara counted them. Those were separate parcels. Looks that way. How many? We don't know yet. This plat is incomplete. Mara pulled out the modern map. Put them together. Daniel gave her the transparent sheet. She aligned the creek first, then the ridge line and surviving road intersection. The old parcels settled across the modern farm like broken pieces beneath a newer drawing. Mara recognized the effect immediately. She had seen renovated buildings where new plans concealed earlier walls. Remove the later layer, and another structure appeared. Pike Farm was assembled over these. Eventually, yes. Then why does my mineral deed still follow the older pattern? Surface and mineral ownership can travel separately. Later surface consolidation doesn't necessarily erase earlier severed mineral interests. Mara thought about Samuel spending years acquiring those interests. So Grandpa was following these old parcels. Possibly. Daniel cautioned her with a glance. We still need the acquisition chain. Mara photographed the mats and called Helen from the courthouse steps. Do you know what Vale School was? Her mother was silent long enough to answer the question before speaking. Where did you hear that Grandpa's mineral deed references Vale School Corner? Daniel found an old survey showing an actual school. Daniel, the surveyor I hired. You hired a surveyor? I'm not selling rights I don't understand. Helen sighed. Mara, your grandfather spent half his life trying to make old maps matter again. You said that already. What was Vale School? An old school, obviously. It was gone before I was born. Mara looked through the courthouse doors toward the records room. There were other buildings around it. Helen did not answer. Mom, what exactly did you find? Old parcels, a road, structures. They're under what became Pike Farm. Another silence. Mara's irritation sharpened. You know something. I know Samuel talked about that place constantly. What place? It doesn't matter anymore. A company is offering me enough money to buy mineral rights under it. It matters to me. Helen's voice hardened. Then sell the rights and let it be somebody else's problem. Why are you so determined that I not look? Because I watched my father spend years looking backward. Looking backward at what? Helen ended the conversation with a promise to call later, which Mara recognized as an attempt to escape it. She returned inside. Daniel had located another survey in a storage sleeve, but age and water damage had destroyed part of its lower corner. The surviving portion was larger and more detailed than the first. This may be what Samuel was working from, he said. Mara helped him flatten the protective sleeve beneath weights. A narrow road ran beside the creek. Rectangles appeared on both sides. One was labeled School. Another larger structure stood farther south. Smaller buildings formed irregular rows along the hollow. That isn't just a few farm buildings, Mara said. No, Daniel pointed to a handwritten title near the damaged margin. Only part was readable. Mara moved closer. The first word was unmistakable. Vale. The second emerged beneath a stain when Daniel adjusted the light. Hollow. Mara stared at it. Vale Hollow. Daniel searched the county mapping database. No current location carried the name. He tried road indexes, then modern parcel records. Nothing. Whatever it was, he said, it isn't represented on the current map. Mara took a photograph and sent it to Helen with a single message. What was Vale Hollow? Helen called within 2 minutes. Where did you get that map? County records? Samuel spent years searching for a complete copy. Then you did know about it. Helen exhaled. I knew the name. What was it? A settlement. A long time ago. Mara looked at the rows of structures. How long? Before my time. Why was Grandpa obsessed with it? Because he thought everyone had forgotten it. Why did he care? Helen became quiet again. When she finally answered, the defensiveness had disappeared from her voice. Because his grandmother lived there, Mara gripped the phone. Samuel had never told her that. Your grandmother? His grandmother, Lydia Vale? Mara turned toward the damaged survey. The old map was no longer an abstract property puzzle. Someone in her family had walked that road, attended that school, or known the people represented by those tiny rectangles. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because by the time I was growing up, Vale Hollow was gone. To me, it was one of Samuel's stories about people and property nobody could bring back. But it was our family. Yes. Daniel, giving Mara privacy, moved to another table. Mara lowered her voice. Did Grandpa leave me those mineral rights because of Vale Hollow? I don't know. You never asked. I spent years asking him to stop spending money and time on old deeds. He never stopped. Helen sounded tired. Mara, I can't give you the answer you want. I don't even know what answer I want. After the call, Mara returned to the maps. She aligned the damaged survey over Pike Farm again, this time knowing she was looking at more than vanished boundary markers. The old road crossed beneath present fields. The school sat within the acreage described by her mineral deed. Dozens of structures occupied land now represented on modern maps without any trace of the name. 18 years ago, Samuel had given 19-year-old Mara rights beneath someone else's farm. Now she knew those rights followed boundaries older than the farm itself, and printed across the forgotten geometry beneath them was the name of a settlement her own family had once called home. Vale Hollow. Mara spent the next 3 days learning that a place could disappear without ever truly vanishing. Daniel began with county tax books because they were less dramatic than maps and often more reliable. Vale Hollow appeared there in fragments: household names, assessed structures, small parcels, school references, livestock, equipment, and occasional notes about delinquent taxes. Nothing looked important by itself. Together, the entries proved that people had lived there in numbers large enough to form a community. Mara sat beside Daniel at a long records table, copying names into a notebook. How many families? She asked. Hard to say exactly yet. He turned another page. But more than a handful. By noon, they had identified nearly 30 household names across overlapping years. Several appeared beside occupations connected to mining, timber, transport, or small trade. Others were simply listed as laborers, widows, farmers, or household heads. The schools showed up in county education reports. A church notice appeared in an old newspaper. A store advertised flour, lamp oil, nails, and winter boots. One article mentioned a meeting hall used for a community supper. Mara stared at the clipping. That sounds like a town. A settlement, Daniel said. Small, but yes, a functioning one. Then why does every modern map show nothing? Maps show what the people making them choose to record at that moment. She glanced at him. That sounds almost philosophical for a surveyor. It's practical. Roads close, names change, parcels combine. A place can stop being administratively useful long before people stop remembering it. Mara thought of Samuel, unless someone refuses to stop remembering. By the end of the afternoon, the pattern became stranger. Vale Hollow appeared regularly in older records, then less often. The school closed, Several household names disappeared from the tax rolls. Property descriptions began referring to larger tracts instead of smaller family parcels. Within a generation, references to Vale Hollow became rare. Later county histories described the same acreage as rough land gradually incorporated into agricultural holdings, eventually becoming part of the Pike property. Mara reread one paragraph twice. This says the area was largely undeveloped. Daniel looked at the older map beside it. That wording doesn't match what we found. There were houses, yes. A school, yes. A store, at least one. Then undeveloped is wrong. Incomplete at minimum. The phrase irritated Mara more than she expected. She had known Vale Hollow existed for only a few days. Yet seeing it reduced to empty ground felt personal. The records did not describe a prosperous place. Some families struggled with taxes. Several deeds showed mortgages or liens. A newspaper notice mentioned a mine closure that affected local employment. But poor was not the same as non-existent. Mara called Owen before driving to Pike Farm again. This time he met her near the farmhouse rather than the barn. She brought copies of the old plat, tax references, and school record. Owen looked at the documents without inviting her inside. You've been busy. There was a settlement here. You told me that. No, I told you there was a name on a map. Now I can show you families. A school. A store. Roads. Owen unfolded the plat across the hood of his truck. And what are you asking from me? Whether your family records mention any of it. His expression tightened. You think my family took something? I didn't say that. You're showing up with maps from before my family owned this place and telling me people disappeared? I'm telling you the county history says this was mostly undeveloped, and that doesn't appear to be true. Owen looked toward the pasture. My grandfather bought land. My father expanded it. Nobody in my family ever told me we erased a town. I'm not accusing you. Feels close. Mara understood his defensiveness because she had felt the same when Helen spoke as if Samuel's obsession had somehow become hers. She lowered her voice. I'm trying to figure out why my grandfather spent decades caring about this place and why he tied my mineral rights to an old survey. That's all. Owen exhaled. I have boxes of deeds in the house. Most of them I've never read. Would you look? You're asking me to help investigate whether my family history is wrong? Mine already was. That made him pause. He finally nodded. Give me an hour. Mara waited outside rather than press the advantage. When Owen returned, he carried a metal document box and set it on a workbench in a side shed. The deeds were not organized as carefully as Samuel's papers. Some were folded in brittle envelopes. Others clipped together with tax receipts. Owen worked through them with visible reluctance. This one is from my grandfather. Too recent, Mara said. Try anything describing earlier tracts. They found references to creek boundaries, ridge lines, and acreage assembled from multiple parcels. Then Owen pulled out a deed with a legal description that made Mara sit forward. Read that again. Owen did. The phrase was brief, being portions of the former Vale tracts. He stopped. Vale, Mara nodded. That's not proof of anything improper. I didn't say it was. But it means my family knew the name. At least whoever drafted this deed did. Owen turned the page. There's no explanation. It's enough to show the modern story is missing something. He frowned at the old document. I grew up here. Nobody ever called this Vale anything. That's what bothers me. For the first time, Owen did not argue. They spent another hour comparing his family papers with Daniel's copies. The records did not show theft or fraud. Instead, they showed gradual consolidation parcels sold, combined, transferred, mortgaged, and renamed, until the Pike holdings formed a continuous farm. Some transactions looked ordinary. Others were too abbreviated to explain why families sold or where they went. The land changed hands legally on paper, but the community disappeared from the language surrounding it. Maybe people just moved, Owen said. Maybe, Mara replied. But then why does later history act like nobody was here? Owen looked at the pasture again. I don't know. Daniel called that evening with another find. A local historical collection had an uncatalogued photograph donated years earlier with materials from Samuel Vale. Mara drove straight there. Daniel was waiting at a reading table when an archivist brought out a flat protective sleeve. Inside was a black and white photograph of several dozen people standing in front of a simple wooden schoolhouse. Children filled the front row. Adults stood behind them. The building's sign was faint but readable. Vale School. Mara leaned closer. How many people, more than 50, in the photograph? Do we know who they are? Not individually. Not yet. She lifted the sleeve carefully and turned it over. A line in Samuel's handwriting ran across the backing card. Mara recognized it immediately. The same deliberate block letters appeared on his estate note. She read the sentence aloud. They did not vanish when the map stopped naming them. Daniel said nothing. Mara looked again at the faces. These were not boundary markers, not mineral parcels, not old legal descriptions. They were people, standing shoulder to shoulder in a place that later records had nearly reduced to empty land. Somewhere among their families had been Lydia Vale, Samuel's grandmother. Somewhere within those vanished parcels lay the reason Samuel had refused to let the name disappear. Mara stared at the photograph and understood that the official story of Pike Farm was not necessarily false, but it was incomplete. Something had existed before the farm. Something large enough to have a school, roads, homes, and dozens of families. And Samuel had preserved the photograph because he wanted proof that when Vale Hollow disappeared from the maps, its people had not disappeared with it. Samuel's records were more extensive than Mara expected. Helen had kept only a few personal items after his death, but the county historical collection still held several boxes he had donated over the years, and the rest of his property files remained in storage with old family papers. Mara spent a Saturday morning opening folders filled with deeds, handwritten notes, tax receipts, correspondence, and photocopies so faded that some pages had to be tilted toward the light to read. At first, the documents looked exactly like the kind of obsessive collection Helen had always described. Samuel had tracked tiny mineral interests across Bellwether County for decades. Some represented 1/2 of one parcel. Others were smaller fractions inherited by several descendants after an owner died. A few interests were so narrow and complicated that Mara could not understand why anyone would bother acquiring them. He paid $75 for this one, she said, holding up a transfer from more than 30 years earlier. Daniel, seated across from her at the records table, check the description. Looks like a fractional mineral interest. $75 for something under land he didn't own? At that time. Maybe that was all the seller thought it was worth. Mara found another. 200, then another, 50. The names changed, but the pattern continued. Samuel had purchased mineral interests from people living in different counties, and in several cases, different states. Some sellers had inherited the rights and apparently wanted to be rid of them. One letter from an elderly man thanked Samuel for simplifying an estate that had been nothing but trouble since my father died. Another seller wrote that she had never seen the property and doubted she ever would. Mara set the letter down. This is exactly what Mom meant. About what Daniel asked. Grandpa spending money on old land nobody cared about? She pulled another receipt from the folder. He wasn't wealthy. He worked as a county records clerk. Why spend decades buying scraps like these? Daniel did not answer immediately. He began arranging copies of the deeds by legal description, because maybe they weren't scraps to him. Mara almost laughed. That sounds like something Samuel would have said. I mean legally. Look here, he placed 3 acquisitions side by side. The first involved a small mineral share beneath an old tract identified by a family surname. The second referred to an adjacent tract. The third used a creek and ridge boundary that matched part of the damaged Vale Hollow map. Mara leaned closer. Those touch? Yes. So let's stop reading them in the order he bought them. Daniel took out a larger map and began marking each acquired interest where it appeared to fall. Mara helped, using parcel dimensions and old reference points to approximate the boundaries. After half an hour, the marks no longer looked random. They clustered across the same area beneath what eventually became Pike Farm. He was buying around the hollow, Mara said, more specifically around the old settlement parcels. Daniel moved another deed into place. See this? Same family name that appears in one of the Vale Hollow tax books? Mara checked her notebook. He was right. The surname belonged to one of the households they had identified near the old school. She searched another transfer. Same result. Then another. The sellers were not just unrelated owners of mineral rights. Many were descendants or later heirs connected to families who had once held small tracts in Vale Hollow. Mara sat back. He was putting them back together. Daniel nodded. At least parts of the mineral estate, but not the surface. No, the surface had already consolidated differently. Mara stared at the map. The contradiction felt almost absurd. Above ground, the old parcels had been absorbed into larger holdings until Pike Farm became one continuous property. Below ground, pieces of ownership had remained scattered through inheritance, severance, and sale. Samuel had spent years moving in the opposite direction, collecting fractions back into one set of hands. Why, Mara asked. Daniel shook his head. The deeds tell us what he bought, not why. Helen gave Mara the answer she had believed for years. When Mara called that afternoon and described what they had found, Helen groaned softly. Yes, that sounds like him. You knew he was buying mineral rights from Vale families? I knew he was buying bits of property interests from people who were happy to get rid of them. Did you ever ask why constantly? What did he say that they mattered? Helen's frustration sharpened. Samuel could make anything sound urgent if it had a deed attached to it. Some of these purchases were tiny, I know. He spent real money, I know that too. I argued with him about it. Mara glanced across the table at the accumulating map. You thought he was wasting it. I still think some of it was wasteful. Helen paused. Mara, you're seeing this as a mystery now because someone offered you money. I lived with it for years. Your grandfather would drive 2 counties away to talk to someone about a mineral share worth less than the gas he used getting there. Maybe he had a plan. Maybe. But plans can still become obsessions. Mara did not argue. That possibility bothered her because Helen had earned the right to remember Samuel differently. Loving him did not require turning every strange decision into wisdom. Later that day, Mara met Owen near the edge of Pike Farm and showed him the map of Samuel's acquisitions. Owen listened in silence until she explained that the mineral interests clustered beneath former Vale Hollow parcels. So your grandfather was buying rights under this farm for years, he said, before some of it was even the farm as it exists now. That doesn't make me feel better. Why Owen looked toward the pasture. Because people usually consolidate mineral rights for a reason. Mara understood what he meant. You think he wanted to mine? What am I supposed to think? Samuel never developed anything. Maybe he was waiting. For what, I don't know. You're the one finding all the papers. Mara felt herself becoming defensive. I didn't know about any of this until last week. And now a resource company wants the rights he assembled? That doesn't mean he assembled them for Harrow Ridge. No. But if he spent years collecting mineral interests, Extraction is the obvious explanation. Not necessarily. Owen's expression hardened. Easy for you to say. You don't live on top of them. The words landed harder than Mara expected. She closed the map. I haven't sold anything. I know. Then stop treating me like I already have. Owen looked away for a moment. Fair. His tone softened, but only slightly. I'm not accusing you. I'm trying to understand what your grandfather intended. Because whatever he intended is under my fields. Mara drove back to the records collection, irritated with Owen, irritated with Helen, and increasingly irritated with Samuel. Everyone had an interpretation of his actions, and none of them could ask him whether they were right. She spent another hour going through a narrow ledger she had almost ignored because most pages contained nothing but dates, names, purchase amounts, and recording references. Then she noticed the surnames, Vale Hollow families, one after another. Beside each mineral acquisition, Samuel had written the name of the family historically connected to that tract. Some names matched tax records. Others matched the old-school photograph notes. Mara called Daniel over. He tracked every one. Daniel scanned the pages. Looks like it. Why list the family instead of just the parcel? That's a good question. Mara turned toward the final entries. Near the bottom of the last completed page, Samuel had drawn a line beneath the acquisitions. Below it, in the same block handwriting Mara had seen on the deed warning, and the photograph he had written 5 words. Mara read them once, then again, and felt the entire theory of what Samuel had been doing shift beneath her. Not for extraction, she whispered. Daniel leaned closer as she finished the sentence. For standing. The phrase, for standing, stayed with Mara for the rest of the evening. She understood enough about property rights to know Samuel might have meant legal standing, the ability to have a recognized interest in decisions affecting the land beneath Pike Farm. But the note still did not explain what he intended to do with that position. The next morning, Daniel called with a practical suggestion. If Harrow Ridge is serious, they'll want subsurface information eventually. You should not rely only on what their people provide. Mara looked at the company's purchase proposal on her table. You're saying I need my own survey? I'm saying if you're going to sell rights Samuel spent decades assembling, you should know what is actually there first. The cost made her hesitate. She had already paid Daniel for records work, and unemployment had turned every expense into an argument with herself. But the words in Samuel's ledger had changed the calculation. If his goal had not been extraction, Mara needed to understand why the underground estate mattered before transferring it to a company whose business was extracting resources. Arrange it, she said. Daniel explained that the work would require more than ordinary boundary surveying. He would coordinate with specialists able to review historical mine records, map known underground features, and compare them with modern subsurface data. Nothing would happen on Pike Farm without Owen's permission for surface access where needed. That conversation went badly at first. Owen met Mara and Daniel beside the equipment shed, listened to the explanation, and immediately shook his head. You want people running tests across the farm because a mining company wants to buy her rights? Because she needs independent information before deciding? Daniel said, That sounds like the same road with a different driver. Mara stepped in. If I wanted the easy version, I would sign Harrow Ridge's papers and let them worry about it later. Owen looked at her. And what happens if your survey finds something that makes those rights more valuable? I don't know. That's the problem. Mara felt irritation rise, but she forced herself to stay practical. You told me whatever I decide underground eventually reaches the surface. I listened. That's why I'm not letting a company tell me what's down there without checking for myself. Owen's expression shifted slightly. Daniel added, The first work is minimally invasive. Records, correlation, surface control points, and subsurface measurements. If anything more is needed, we ask first. Owen considered it. No cutting fences, no equipment in the cattle field without me there. Agreed, Daniel said. And if you find old workings, we document them. We don't enter unstable spaces. That concern was not theoretical. Historical mining records already showed abandoned workings in the broader area. And Owen had spent his life hearing stories about hidden voids, old shafts, and drainage problems beneath Appalachian land. He finally gave limited permission. I want copies of anything that affects the farm, Mara nodded. So do I. The first days of work were disappointingly ordinary. Daniel established reference points and compared the modern Pike Farm layout against the old Vale Hollow survey. Specialists reviewed known mine maps and historical geological records. Mara expected some dramatic machine to reveal the ground instantly. Instead, the process involved measurements, repeated passes, data cleaning, and arguments over whether an irregularity meant geology, human disturbance, or simply bad historical mapping. She spent much of the time standing beside Daniel with rolled copies of the Vale Hollow Plat, helping align old measurements with present features. Her drafting background made the comparisons almost familiar. The old road should cross here, she said one afternoon. Daniel checked the overlay. Within 20 feet. That's a lot for a modern building plan. Yes, for a damaged historical survey tied to vanished landmarks, not necessarily. Mara glanced across the pasture. Nothing suggested a road had ever existed there. Grass moved in the wind. Fence posts followed a newer line. The surface made Samuel's obsession seem foolish again. Then one of the subsurface specialists called Daniel over. Mara could not interpret the screen. Only bands, traces, and marked coordinates. Daniel asked several questions before turning to her. There's an anomaly here. What kind? Too early to say. It could be old workings, disturbed fill, or something structural. Owen, standing nearby, frowned. Under what part of the farm? Daniel pointed toward a field beyond the barn. Owen's concern became immediate. How deep? Variable. We need more passes before I give you anything useful. Is it dangerous? We don't know that it's a void. Mara saw Owen's jaw tighten. Until then, the survey had been her investigation. In that moment, it became his problem too. If there's a safety issue, we deal with it before anything else, she said. Owen looked at her, then nodded once. Over the next 2 days, the team refined the data. Known abandoned mine features accounted for some irregularities. Others did not match the historical mine maps. A set of lines appeared where Daniel expected natural formations to be less regular. He refused to speculate. Straight does not automatically mean building, he told Mara. Human activity can leave a lot of patterns underground, but it's not natural, not obviously. They overlaid the anomaly coordinates on the modern farm map. Mara studied the spacing. Several lines ran roughly parallel. Another turned at what looked almost like a right angle. That looks designed. It looks regular, Daniel corrected. That's all I'm willing to say. Owen joined them. Does it connect to mining? Not on the maps we have. Then what is it? Daniel gave him the same answer. We need historical comparison. Mara unfolded the damaged Vale Hollow survey on the hood of Daniel's truck. The paper copy showed the old road, smaller parcels, and rectangles representing structures. She began aligning the creek crossing first. Then the ridge reference they had already confirmed. Daniel placed the survey data transparency over it. Mara adjusted the scale. One of the subsurface anomalies fell beneath a rectangular mark on the old map. She stopped. What was that building? Daniel leaned closer. The label was faint but readable. School. Owen stared at the overlay. Mara felt a pulse of unease. Vale School. Daniel nodded. They checked another anomaly. It corresponded with a cluster of small rectangles farther down the old road. Those were houses, Mara said. Probably residences. Daniel replied, probably. We still need to verify, but the alignment is real. Daniel did not answer immediately. He measured again, changed the overlay slightly, and checked the fixed reference points. The result remained. One regular anomaly matched the old school footprint. Another matched part of the residential row. Additional subsurface features appeared near structures shown on the damaged Vale Hollow survey. Owen looked from the map to the pasture beyond them, as though trying to imagine walls where there was now only grass. So there are pieces of it still down there. Daniel kept his voice careful. There is subsurface evidence consistent with locations shown on the historical map. For Mara, the cautious language did nothing to reduce the impact. Samuel's warning had begun with a survey she could not find. The old deed had led to a school that had vanished from modern maps. The school led to Vale Hollow, now beneath Pike Farm. The first independent underground survey had found physical patterns where Vale Hollow's buildings had once stood. Mara could not stop thinking about the school. The survey data was preliminary, Daniel kept reminding her, but the alignment between the underground anomalies and the old Vale Hollow map was too close to ignore. The next morning she returned to Samuel's donated papers, no longer searching only for deeds. If he had spent decades rebuilding mineral interests around Vale Hollow, then somewhere he might have written down what the place meant to him. The boxes contained more than property records. Mara found family correspondence, notes from interviews, newspaper copies, and several folders labeled with names she recognized from the old tax rolls. Near the bottom of one carton was a thinner file marked Lydia Vale. Mara stopped. Samuel's grandmother, her own great-great-grandmother. Inside were handwritten pages in Samuel's block lettering, apparently copied from conversations with Lydia late in her life, along with several sheets written in a different, shakier hand. Daniel was working at another table. Mara called him over. I think these are her words. He examined the first page. Looks like your grandfather recorded them. Mara began reading. Lydia described Vale Hollow as it had been when she was a child. Her memories were not romantic. Winters were difficult, money was often short, families depended on mine work, timber jobs, small farms, and one another. She remembered the school as cold in January and crowded in spring. Children shared books. Mothers traded preserved food. Men repaired roofs after storms. The store extended credit when wages were late. She makes it sound ordinary, Mara said. Daniel nodded. That may be the important part. The settlement had not been a grand, lost town. It had simply been a place where people lived. Lydia wrote about walking the road beside the creek, carrying lunch to her father, and hearing the meeting bell when someone needed help. She remembered arguments, too. Disputes over wages, property lines, debts, and which families were considering leaving. Mara kept reading until the tone changed. Work became less reliable. Larger companies acquired surrounding mineral interests. Some local owners sold land willingly because the offers were better than anything they expected to earn from it. Others borrowed against property when work slowed. Families with liens faced choices that were legal on paper but brutal in practice. One of Lydia's notes said, There were men who said selling was freedom because a person could take the money and leave. Sometimes that was true. Sometimes leaving was the only thing the money was enough to do. Mara read that line twice. She found another page where Samuel had written questions down one side and Lydia's answers beside them. Did everyone lose their land? No. Did everyone sell unwillingly? No. Were people forced out at the same time? No. The truth was slower and less clean. One parcel changed hands, then another. A mine closed, a family moved for work. Someone died and heirs sold. Debt pushed another household out. Surface holdings grew larger as the small tracts disappeared. Within years, enough families had left that the school could no longer remain open. Vale Hollow did not vanish in one event. It thinned until there were too few people left to keep the name alive. Mara felt something inside her shift. Until then, she had half expected to discover a single wrong powerful enough to explain everything. Lydia's testimony offered no such simplicity. There was pressure, loss, unequal bargaining, and economic necessity, but also individual choices that differed from family to family. The injustice was partly in what happened afterward. Later histories compressed those lives into the idea that the land had always been mostly empty. Near the end of the folder, Mara found a page Samuel had underlined. Lydia had been asked why she still cared about a place where she no longer lived. Her answer was short. They said the hollow was empty after we left. It was easier than saying who had been there. Mara sat back. For a moment, the records room felt too quiet. Daniel read the sentence over her shoulder. That explains some of Samuel. Some. Mara touched the page lightly. Not all. She called Helen from the hallway. Her mother answered on the fourth ring. I found Lydia's testimony. Helen said nothing. Grandpa recorded her memories of Vale Hollow. I know. Mara closed her eyes. You knew about that too? I knew he talked to her. I knew he wrote things down. Why did you never tell me? Because I didn't want you growing up inside his grief. Mara leaned against the wall. It wasn't his grief. He didn't even live there. That didn't matter to Samuel. Helen's voice carried an exhaustion deeper than irritation. He inherited everybody's losses as if they were his responsibility. Maybe he just didn't want them forgotten. And maybe I spent my childhood listening to stories about land we didn't own, houses that were gone, people who were dead. And things nobody could fix. Mara stayed quiet. Helen continued. Your grandfather could turn a family dinner into a lesson about which tract belonged to which vale 50 years before I was born. Every time somebody sold an old mineral share, he acted like history itself was slipping away. So you wanted out? Yes. The answer came without hesitation. I wanted to live somewhere that wasn't measured against what used to be there. Mara thought of her mother leaving Bellwether County, building a life elsewhere, and treating Samuel's papers like emotional clutter. You thought forgetting was healthier. Not forgetting, moving forward. Is there a difference? Helen sighed. There was to me. Mara returned to Lydia's file and described the survey results, the structural lines beneath Pike Farm, the anomaly matching the school, the possible residential row. Helen became quiet again. So something is still there. Pieces, maybe. Daniel won't call them structures yet. But the pattern matches. Samuel would have been pleased. Would he? He spent half his life wanting proof that Vale Hollow wasn't just a story old people told. Mara looked through the glass door toward Daniel and the boxes of Samuel's records. Why did he leave the mineral rights to me instead of you? I don't know. Did he ever ask you to take them? Helen laughed once without humor. He knew better. Because you would have sold them. Probably. The honesty surprised Mara. And you think that would have been wrong? I think I wanted no part of his mission. That's different. Mara returned to the table after the call. She read Lydia's testimony from beginning to end, then placed it beside Samuel's ledger with the words, not for extraction, for standing. 2 generations of choices sat in front of her now. Samuel had spent decades preserving fragments because he feared erasure. Helen had spent decades distancing herself because she feared being trapped by the past. Mara understood both of them more clearly than she wanted to. Samuel had chosen preservation. Helen had chosen escape. And somehow, without asking for either one, Mara had inherited both impulses. The completed survey arrived on a gray Monday morning in a digital report so technical that Mara understood only part of it on the first read. Daniel had warned her not to expect a dramatic photograph of a buried town. What the specialists had produced instead was a layered set of measurements, subsurface scans, historical overlays, depth estimates, and annotated maps showing where the ground beneath Pike Farm had been disturbed by human activity. Mara met Daniel at his office because she did not trust herself to interpret the findings alone. He had already printed several large sheets by the time she arrived. "Before you ask," he said, "no, we did not find an intact town underground." Mara set her bag down. "I wasn't expecting streets and roofs." "Good, because what survived is less theatrical and more useful." He spread the first map across the table. The modern farm appeared in clean lines, fields, access roads, structures, fences, drainage. Over it, the survey team had marked subsurface anomalies in different colors. Some were irregular and connected to known abandoned workings. Those formed cleaner geometric patterns. "These," Daniel said, pointing to a series of shallow, rectangular features, "are consistent with filled cellar depressions or foundation cuts." Mara leaned closer. "Consistent with?" "Not definitely. Correct." He moved to another section. "These linear features correspond with old retaining structures or walls. Here we have sealed passages. Some are likely related to historical mine access. Others do not match recorded mine plans." Mara studied the page. "And this possible filled shaft? We are not opening it." "I'm fine with that." Daniel gave her a brief smile. "Owen is even more fine with that." The next sheet carried the historical Vale Hollow survey over the modern data. Mara recognized the school rectangle immediately. Beneath it, the survey showed a shallow concentration of regular subsurface disturbance nearly identical in size and orientation. Farther south, a row of smaller rectangles on Samuel's damaged map corresponded with repeating foundation-like signatures. "The houses," Mara said. "Likely residential structures, yes." "How likely?" Daniel folded his arms. "High enough that I would not dismiss the match as coincidence. Not high enough that I'd tell a newspaper we discovered buried houses." Mara appreciated the restraint, though part of her wanted certainty. "What about the road Daniel pointed to? A faint linear feature cutting through the field." "The old roadbed is still detectable in places beneath later grading." Mara stared at it. The surface she had walked across with Owen had looked completely ordinary. Underneath, enough remained to trace where people had once moved from the school toward the homes and farther down the hollow. So Vale Hollow is still there. Daniel chose his words carefully. Evidence of Vale Hollow is still there. That distinction mattered. The settlement had not been preserved whole beneath the farm like something sealed under glass. Buildings had been demolished, filled, buried, graded over, or absorbed into later land use. Mine activity had disturbed some areas. Natural erosion had changed others. Yet the survey confirmed that the historical map corresponded to physical remains. Vale Hollow had occupied the ground exactly where Samuel's record said it had. Mara looked at the overlay and thought of Lydia's sentence. "They said the hollow was empty after we left." It was easier than saying who had been there. "Can we show Owen?" she asked. "He's entitled to know anything relevant to the surface property." They met him that afternoon beside the farmhouse. Daniel brought printed copies and kept the explanation practical. He identified the likely cellar features: old road trace, sealed passages, and areas corresponding with known historical mining. Owen listened without interrupting until Daniel reached the possible shaft. "Is any of this a current hazard?" he asked. Nothing in the completed survey says there is an immediate surface collapse emergency. Daniel replied, but there are areas where future heavy disturbance should be approached carefully. So if someone brought equipment in here, they would need more detailed planning. Owen glanced at Mara. Meaning a mineral company? Meaning anyone doing major subsurface work, Daniel said. Mara appreciated that he refused to turn the report into an argument for either side. Owen looked at the historical overlay. That's the school, the probable school footprint, and those residential row. Owen was quiet for a long moment. I've driven equipment over that field since I was 16, Mara said. You couldn't have known. Still strange. For me too. They walked toward the pasture, carrying the map. Daniel stopped near one survey marker and oriented the sheet. From here, the school would have been slightly uphill. Owen looked at the empty grass. There's nothing on the surface, Mara said. The words came out more heavily than she intended. Owen looked at her, then back toward the field. My father would have called this old debris. My mother would probably call it something better left alone. And you, Mara, did not answer immediately. I'm still figuring that out. The survey changed something practical as well. Before, Mara's uncertainty had centered on Samuel's intention. Now there was another fact she could not ignore. Future mineral development might disturb physical evidence of Vale Hollow before it was fully documented. Daniel showed her where several subsurface features overlapped with portions of her mineral estate. If extraction or access work were proposed here, he said, historical features could be affected, depending on method and location. Destroyed, potentially disturbed, some features are already compromised. Others may be relatively intact below grade. And if I sell, then the rights transfer according to whatever agreement you sign. You keep saying that like I should know what I want. I'm saying the survey can tell you what is there. It cannot tell you what to do about it. That evening, Mara returned home with the report beside her. Her unemployment applications waited unanswered in her inbox. 2 bills were due within the week. The Harrow Ridge proposal still sat on the kitchen table. For the first time since receiving it, she felt the full weight of how convenient selling would be. She had already spent money on Daniel Records and the independent survey. Harrow Ridge's original offer could repay all of that many times over. She opened the report again and looked at the historical overlay. The school, the residential row, the old road. Filled cellars, retaining structures, sealed passages, mine-related features. Not a secret city, not treasure, just enough physical evidence to prove that Vale Hollow had occupied a landscape modern maps had flattened into something simpler. Samuel's warning finally made sense in a way it had not when she first found it. Do not transfer the lower rights until the Vale survey is compared. He had wanted whoever held those rights to see both versions of the ground before giving up control of what lay beneath it. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed Colin Mercer from Harrow Ridge Resources. Mara answered. Ms. Ellison, I wanted to follow up now that we understand independent survey work has been completed. She glanced at the report. How did you hear that? These things circulate when title and mineral interests are being evaluated. We remain very interested. Mara said nothing. Colin continued, in fact, based on the updated information and our internal review, we're prepared to revise our purchase offer. Revise it how? He gave her the new figure. Mara stopped breathing for a second. The amount was significantly higher than before. Enough to erase the immediate fear of unemployment, enough to give her months, perhaps years, of breathing room, if she managed it carefully. She wrote the number on the edge of the survey report and stared at it beside the faded outline of Vale School. We can send updated terms tonight, Colin said. You don't have to answer now. Send them after the call. Mara sat alone at the table, The completed survey had proven that Samuel's forgotten settlement was not just a family story or an obsolete name on a damaged map. Something remained beneath Pike Farm, and any serious disturbance could affect what was left. But the same discovery had made her mineral rights more complicated at exactly the moment Harrow Ridge made them more valuable. Mara looked at the new offer, then at the underground footprint of Vale Hollow. For the first time, she understood that learning what lay beneath the farm had not made her decision easier. It had made the cost of choosing much higher. The revised Harrow Ridge offer arrived before Mara went to bed. She opened it twice, hoping the second reading would expose some condition that made the number less tempting. It did not. The company wanted broad control of the mineral interests Samuel had assembled, subject to title verification and the access provisions that would have to be negotiated with surface owners. Mara would receive enough money to cover her current bills, replace the savings unemployment had begun consuming, and give herself a financial cushion she had never possessed. By morning, the offer had become harder to think about rather than easier. She met Colin Mercer at a cafe near the county courthouse because she wanted to hear what Harrow Ridge actually intended. Colin was professional and careful. He did not promise immediate extraction, nor did he pretend the company was interested in Vale Hollow for historical reasons. "We acquire mineral positions where future development may be economically viable," he explained. Future meaning when. That depends on markets, permitting, geology, access, and several other factors. Would you need control over the entire interest I inherited? That is what our current offer covers. Mara placed the underground survey between them. You know there are historical features beneath the property. We know your independent work identified subsurface anomalies and old workings. Not just workings. The features correspond to a settlement. Colin nodded. That would be evaluated if development moved forward. Evaluated before or after you own the rights, Ms. Ellison. Purchasing the mineral estate does not eliminate regulatory obligations or surface negotiations. It was a reasonable answer, which somehow made Mara more uncomfortable. Harrow Ridge did not need to be dishonest for its priorities to differ from Samuel's. "I'm not signing today," she said. "That's your decision. Will the offer stay open for a limited period?" He gave her the deadline. Mara left with the proposal still unsigned. Owen was less neutral when she told him. They stood near the barn at Pike Farm while he repaired a gate latch. "Broad control," he repeated. "That's what the agreement says." "Then my answer hasn't changed." "It isn't your offer." Owen straightened. "No. It's just my farm sitting on top of it." Mara felt the old defensiveness return. "And it's my inheritance sitting underneath." "I know. Do you? Because every time money comes up, you talk as if the only moral choice is for me to walk away from it." "I never said that. You don't have to. Your family owns 300 acres I can see. I inherited rights I couldn't even explain until a month ago. Now they finally have real value, and somehow I'm supposed to feel selfish for noticing?" Owen stared at her. "You think I chose what happened to Vale Hollow? No. You think my father did? No. Then stop talking like I'm standing here because my family won something from yours." Mara folded her arms. "Your family did end up with the surface, and yours kept rights underneath it. Neither of us made those arrangements." His voice lowered. "I inherited a farm with fences, taxes, cattle, drainage problems, and whatever old workings are under those fields. You inherited mineral rights with their own problems. We both got consequences from people who are dead." The words quieted her anger because they were difficult to deny. "That doesn't make the value equal," she said. "I didn't say it did." Owen looked toward the field where the old school footprint lay beneath the grass. I'm asking you not to make me responsible for history just because I'm the person standing here now. Mara thought of how quickly she had resented being treated as responsible for Samuel's intentions. Fair, she said finally. Owen nodded. And I'm not asking you to give away something valuable just to protect me. Then what are you asking? Know what you're selling before somebody else gets to decide what happens with it. It sounded uncomfortably like Samuel's warning. Later, Mara brought the Harrow Ridge Agreement to Daniel. He refused to tell her whether to accept it. I can explain what the survey means, he said. I'm not your attorney, financial advisor, or conscience. That's extremely unhelpful. It's also true. He spread the historical overlay beside the modern mineral map. There may be alternatives to an outright sale. Retaining interests, negotiating restrictions, different lease structures. But every alternative has trade-offs, and you'd need proper legal advice. So there's no clean solution. Property this old rarely comes with one. What happens if I sell everything? Control shifts according to the contract. And if I keep everything, then you keep the rights. The uncertainty, and whatever responsibility you believe comes with knowing what's beneath them. Mara looked at the school footprint. Samuel knew that. Probably, he could have sold these interests himself. Apparently, he chose not to. That afternoon, she returned to the historical collection and opened Samuel's files again. She was no longer searching for evidence that Valley Hollow existed. The survey had settled that question as far as she needed. She wanted to understand what Samuel thought ownership could accomplish. His ledger had said for standing, but standing for what? She found correspondence with descendants whose mineral shares he had purchased. Some were routine. Others showed Samuel explaining why he wanted interests too small to generate meaningful income alone. He rarely said much. He asked about family names, old parcel descriptions, and whether sellers possessed earlier deeds. Mara began to see that each purchase had given him more than fractional ownership. It had allowed him to rebuild a legal connection to ground whose history had been divided among people who no longer lived there. Near the back of the file was a folder marked Consolidation. Inside were draft maps, calculations, and a short memorandum in Samuel's handwriting. Mara read slowly. Samuel described Vale Hollow's surface parcels disappearing into later ownership, while severed mineral interests continued through descendants. He wrote that historical recognition without any surviving property interest could be ignored whenever development became inconvenient. Consolidating mineral interests gave their holder a position from which questions had to be answered before certain rights could simply be transferred or exercised. Mara felt her pulse quicken. This was not proof that Samuel had anticipated Harrow Ridge specifically. He had not. It was something simpler. He had wanted one person to retain enough legal interest that Vale Hollow could not be treated as empty ground without that person first having a choice. She reached the final page. One paragraph had been crossed out. Beneath it, Samuel had rewritten the thought in a single sentence, larger than the surrounding notes. Mara recognized the deliberate handwriting from the warning attached to her inheritance. Ownership was never the purpose. The ability to prevent erasure was. Mara sat motionless. Samuel had not spent decades collecting mineral rights because he wanted to possess what lay beneath Pike Farm. He had assembled them because possession created leverage. It created standing. It created the ability to say no, long enough for someone to ask what might be destroyed by saying yes. Mara looked at the Harrow Ridge offer beside Samuel's memorandum. The company was offering her more money than she had ever held at once. Owen wanted his farm protected. Daniel could explain the ground but would not make the decision. Helen had spent her life refusing Samuel's burden. None of them could decide what the inheritance meant now. Samuel had preserved the mineral rights so that someone would still have the power to stop Vale Hollow from being erased a second time. And 18 years after he placed that power in the hands of a 19-year-old girl, the person who could now say yes or no was Mara. Mara drove to Helen's house the next morning with Samuel's memorandum folded inside her bag and the Harrow Ridge deadline less than a day away. Her mother opened the door, took one look at Mara's face and said, "You found something else? I found why Grandpa kept buying the mineral rights." Helen stepped aside. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table where Mara had eaten countless meals as a teenager, back when Samuel's stories had felt like background noise and Bellwether County belonged to another generation. Mara placed Samuel's handwritten page between them. He wasn't trying to mine Vale Hollow. Helen read the final sentence slowly. Ownership was never the purpose. The ability to prevent erasure was. She did not look surprised. "That sounds like him. Then why did he leave all of it to me?" Helen's eyes lifted. "I told you. I don't know. I was 19, I remember. I barely understood what mineral rights were. He spent decades collecting these interests, then handed them to someone who thought they were useless?" Helen folded her hands. "Maybe he thought you wouldn't sell them." "Why would he think that I almost did? You're asking me to explain my father's thinking 18 years after he died. I'm asking because you knew him better than I did." Helen looked away. "Not always." Mara had heard enough evasions. "There's something else, isn't there?" Her mother's expression tightened. "What makes you say that?" "Because every time Samuel comes up, you tell me how obsessed he was. Every time Vale Hollow comes up, you tell me to move on. And every time I ask why he chose me, you say you don't know too quickly." Helen stood and walked to a narrow cabinet near the dining room. She remained there for several seconds before opening the bottom door. From behind old table linens, she pulled a flat cardboard box. Mara stared at it. "What is that?" "Something your grandfather left with me. For you." "No," Helen returned to the table. "For you." Mara felt anger before curiosity. "You've had something of mine for 18 years. He told me not to interfere with it unless you started asking about Vale Hollow." "That sounds like interference." "I know." Helen placed the box in front of her. "You can be angry." "I am." "I assumed you would be." Mara did not open it immediately. "Why keep it?" "Because after he died, you were 19 and leaving for school. You thought the mineral inheritance was ridiculous. I thought Samuel had already put enough of his old land problems into your life. So you decided I shouldn't know." "Yes." The honesty was almost worse than an excuse. Mara pushed back from the table. "You didn't have the right." "Probably not. Probably." Helen's voice remained quiet. "No, I didn't." That stopped Mara. Her mother looked tired. "I told myself I was protecting you from becoming like him. I also knew that was what I wanted. Not necessarily what you wanted." Mara opened the box. The first items were old building plans, not deeds. She recognized the paper immediately. Heavy, yellowed sheets with hand-drawn walls, dimensions, notes, and corrections. One showed a small commercial building. Another looked like a school or meeting hall. A third was an older residential plan. "Why would Grandpa keep these?" she asked. "Because of you." Mara frowned. Helen pulled a chair closer. "Do you remember the summer before you started your drafting program?" Mara looked again at the plans. A memory surfaced slowly. Samuel had spread one across his dining table during a visit. Mara had been impatient because she wanted to meet friends later. He had asked what she thought of the drawing. "I remember arguing with him about a wall." Mara stared at the plan. Now she remembered more. Samuel had pointed to a faded outline and said the structure probably never had a partition there because it was missing from a later copy. Mara had compared measurements and insisted the dimensions made no sense without another wall. "I told him the drawing had been changed." You told him a missing wall on one plan didn't mean the wall had never existed. Mara touched the paper. I was 19. Exactly. Helen reached into the box and handed her a folded note. Samuel's handwriting covered 2 pages. The letter was not addressed directly to Mara. It read more like instructions to Helen. Written shortly before his death. Samuel described that afternoon with the old building plan. He wrote that Mara had looked at what was absent and asked whether the record, rather than the building, was incomplete. He had been struck by the question because it was the same problem he had spent years confronting with Vale Hollow. Mara read the line again. He chose me because I corrected a drawing. Not just that. Helen pointed to the next paragraph. Samuel wrote that Mara was beginning architectural drafting because she understood something he had learned much later. Records shape what future people believe existed. A drawing, map, deed, or history could omit something real. Absence from paper was not proof of absence from life. Then came a sentence that made Mara's throat tighten. She notices what is missing without immediately deciding it was never there. Mara set the page down. He never told me this. No. Why not? Keep reading. Samuel anticipated that question. He wrote that Mara was too young to be burdened with Vale Hollow as an obligation. If he explained everything and asked her to preserve his work, she might accept from love, guilt, or pressure rather than understanding. He wanted her to inherit the mineral position first and decide later what it meant, if it ever meant anything to her at all. That's insane, Mara said softly. He left me a legal problem instead of a conversation. I argued with him. You knew some of it, not the full records, but I knew he intended to leave you the rights. Mara read on. Samuel acknowledged that Mara might sell them someday. He did not forbid it. He did not write that preserving Vale Hollow mattered more than her future. Instead, he explained that the rights were meant to delay irreversible decisions until the person holding them understood what was at stake. If Mara chooses to sell after she knows what the rights protect, he wrote, then the choice is hers, not mine. Mara felt some of her anger shift. Not disappear, shift. He really thought I'd figure all this out myself. Helen gave a small, sad smile. Samuel had unreasonable faith in paperwork. Mara almost laughed. Instead, she looked at the old plans again. The memory returned more clearly now. Samuel leaning over the drawing, asking how she knew the missing wall had existed. Mara had pointed to measurements that otherwise could not reconcile. She had said, "A missing wall on a drawing does not prove the wall never stood." Samuel had gone quiet after that. She had assumed she had annoyed him. In the box was one final note, shorter than the others. Samuel wrote that if Mara ever reached the point of comparing the Vale survey with the mineral estate, she should be reminded of that sentence. He had underlined it. A missing wall on a drawing does not prove the wall never stood. Mara looked at Helen. That was the reason. Part of it. He thought I might understand maps. He thought you might understand what maps could leave out. Mara folded the note carefully. For the first time, Samuel's choice no longer felt random. It was still controlling in ways she disliked. He had given a 19-year-old girl a complicated inheritance and trusted time to supply the explanation he refused to give. But he had also written something else clearly he did not expect Mara to. Preserve his mission simply because he had preserved her ability to choose. Her phone vibrated on the table. A message from Colin Mercer appeared. Harrow Ridge needed her final answer by the next morning. Mara looked at Samuel's note, then at the old plans he had saved because of one conversation she had nearly forgotten, 18 years earlier. Samuel had chosen her because she understood that something missing from a record might still have existed. Now, by morning,
Mara would have to decide whether the same principal was worth more than the largest offer she had ever received. Mara arrived at Pike Farm before Owen finished morning chores. The sky was pale over the ridge, and a thin layer of mist sat low above the fields where Vale Hollow had once stood. She had brought the Harrow Ridge offer, Samuel's notes, and the historical overlay Daniel prepared. None of them felt like an answer. Owen came from the barn carrying a coil of rope and stopped when he saw her beside the gate. "You're early." "I didn't sleep much." He glanced at the folder under her arm. "Deadline this morning." Owen set the rope down. "You made a decision?" "Not yet." He looked surprised but did not push. Instead, he opened the gate. "Walk with me." Mara followed him along a narrow farm track toward the lower pasture. The ground was damp, and their boots collected mud as they passed a line of fencing. For several minutes they said nothing. Mara had been on the property enough times now to recognize places from Daniel's overlays. Near the creek, the old Vale Hollow road had once turned. Farther uphill, beneath a stretch of grass, survey data suggested the footprint of the school. None of it was visible without the maps. "It's strange," she said. "What is knowing exactly where something used to be and still not being able to see it?" Owen glanced toward the field. "I've been thinking about that too." Attacked near a rise overlooking much of the farm. Mara unfolded the historical overlay against the wind. The modern field boundaries sat above the older settlement plan. Two different versions of the same land occupying one sheet. Owen held one corner. "My family always talked about improving this place," he said. "Clearing fields, fixing drainage, rebuilding fences, making something useful out of rough ground." "That doesn't mean Vale Hollow wasn't useful before." "I know. I'm not accusing you." "I know that too." He paused. "At first, I thought you were going to—" Mara folded her arms against the cold. "At first, I thought you were just the family that ended up with everything above ground. And I thought you were somebody who'd show up with a mineral company and tell me the surface didn't matter because you owned what was underneath." Mara gave a tired smile. "We were both generous." Owen almost laughed. "Apparently," his expression became serious again. "My grandfather bought some of these tracts. My father worked them. I grew up thinking that was the whole story. Finding out there were families here before us doesn't make what we built fake." "No, but it doesn't make them fake either." Mara looked down at the map. That was the part she had struggled to hold together. The Pike Farm was real. Owen's work was real. So were Lydia's memories. So were the school, the homes, the people whose names had gradually vanished from county language. Recognizing one history did not require erasing another. "I was angry with you," Mara said, "because your family had the visible part, the land, the farmhouse, the fields, everything people recognize as inheritance." Owen nodded. "And you had rights you couldn't see." "Exactly. For 18 years. I thought Samuel left me the leftover part. Then Harrow Ridge put a number on it, and suddenly I wanted that number to prove it had mattered." Owen looked at her. "Does it, Mara?" "Considers the question." "The money matters. I'm unemployed. My savings are shrinking. I'd be lying if I said the offer doesn't feel like rescue. Then don't pretend it doesn't. But I also know what selling broad control means now." Owen rubbed his hands together against the cold. "You don't owe my farm a sacrifice, and you don't owe my family guilt." He nodded. "That sounds closer to fair." They continued walking until they reached the approximate location of Vale School. Daniel's marker remained near the edge of the field. Mara stopped beside it and imagined Lydia as a child, crossing ground that no longer remembered her footsteps. She realized Samuel's work had tempted her toward a different kind of simplification. It would have been easy to turn Vale Hollow into a story where one side was harmed and another side won. The records did not support that clean version. Some families sold willingly, some left under pressure, some lost options through debt and economic decline. The Pike family inherited later surface holdings. Samuel's side preserved underground fragments. Everyone standing there now had received consequences, not original guilt. Owen looked at the marker. If you sell, what happens next, I don't know. Harrow Ridge says future development depends on permits, economics, access, all of it. So maybe nothing, or maybe the rights change hands again later. That's what bothers me. Once I transfer broad control, I can't pretend I still get to decide. Daniel said there were other structures you could negotiate. There are, but not before this deadline, and not without legal work. Mara pulled Samuel's memorandum from her folder. He spent decades putting these interests back together because fragmented rights were easy to ignore. If I sell them now, I may be undoing the one thing he actually accomplished. Owen studied her. Are you keeping them because he wanted you to? Mara looked toward the ridge. That's the question I've been asking myself. And Samuel said the choice had to be mine. If I keep them because I'm afraid to disappoint a dead man, then he still made the choice. So why keep them? Mara took a long breath. Because I know what's here now. That answer felt different as soon as she said it. She was not 19, inheriting incomprehensible paperwork. She was 37, standing over a mapped settlement with survey evidence, family testimony, and legal rights that gave her a voice in whatever happened next. I don't know what the rights may be worth 10 years from now, she said. I don't know whether keeping them will be smart financially, but I know I'm not ready to transfer control while the site is still barely documented. Owen nodded slowly. That sounds like a decision. Mara checked the time. Harrow Ridge expected her answer within the hour. I think it is. Back at her car, she called Colin Mercer. He answered quickly. Miss Ellison, I'm calling about the offer. Of course. Mara looked across the farm before speaking. I'm declining the current acquisition proposal. There was a brief silence. May I ask whether this is about price? No. We may have some flexibility. I understand I'm still declining broad transfer of the rights. Colin remained professional. If your position changes, you know how to reach us. Thank you. The call ended without drama. No argument, no threat, just a decision that left Mara standing beside her car with the same unemployment problem she had yesterday. Her bills were still due. Her savings were still limited. For a moment, she felt almost foolish. She had just rejected more money than she had ever been offered for anything. Owen seemed to understand what she was thinking. You okay? Ask me after I pay rent. Fair. Mara laughed, despite herself. Then she looked back toward the invisible line of the old road. I need to figure out what comes next. With the mineral rights? With all of it. She did not mean extracting anything. She meant the records, the survey, Lydia's testimony, the old school photograph, the family names Samuel had matched to each tract. Keeping the rights only mattered if the history they protected became visible enough that it could no longer be casually erased. Owen followed her gaze. So what do you do with rights you can't see? Mara thought about the question Samuel had left her, without ever asking it directly. For 18 years, she had assumed the inheritance mattered only if someone eventually paid for what lay underground. Now she understood that its value could also come from what it allowed her to prevent, preserve, and prove. She looked across Pike Farm toward the buried footprint of Vale Hollow. Make sure people can finally see what was here. Mara's decision not to sell did not solve anything by itself.
The mineral rights was still complicated. Pike Farm still belonged to Owen. The underground features still needed careful documentation. And Mara was still unemployed. What changed was that she finally knew what she wanted the rights to accomplish. Over the next several weeks, she worked with Daniel, Owen, the county historical collection, and specialists familiar with old industrial sites to create a plan that treated the land as both a working farm and a documented historical landscape. The first rule was simple. Nobody would tear into the ground merely to satisfy curiosity. Daniel marked the areas where the survey had identified likely cellars, foundation lines, sealed passages, retaining structures, old mine-related features, and the probable footprint of Vale School. Those locations would be treated as sensitive until they could be assessed properly. Owen agreed to avoid unnecessary disturbance in the most significant areas, but Mara refused to ask him to stop farming the land entirely. "I'm not turning your farm into a museum," she told him as they stood over Daniel's updated map in the farmhouse kitchen. "Good," Owen said, "because the cows won't appreciate the educational mission." Mara smiled. "And I'm not giving up the mineral rights." "I didn't ask you to. I know that mattered." Their conversations had changed from arguments over whose inheritance carried greater weight to practical discussions about how two different ownership interests could coexist. Owen retained the surface. Mara retained the mineral estate Samuel had assembled. Any future lease, sale, or development proposal involving her rights would have to account for the documented historical features and surface protections they were now identifying. Nothing about that arrangement was effortless, but it was possible. Daniel helped prepare maps clear enough for non-specialists to understand. Mara used her drafting experience to clean up old plans, align dimensions, and create readable overlays without pretending uncertain details were certain. For the first time since her employer had closed, she spent hours doing technical drawing work without feeling as though she were merely trying to prove she still had a profession. She knew why the lines mattered. The historical collection began digitizing Samuel's deeds, maps, tax records, and correspondence. Mara worked through the ledger that had once looked like proof of her grandfather's obsession and built an index connecting each acquired mineral interest to the original Vale Hollow family name Samuel had recorded. The old school photograph was scanned at high resolution. Lydia Vale's testimony was transcribed carefully, with the original wording preserved. Newspaper notices, school references, tax records, and church mentions were arranged into a timeline showing that Vale Hollow had not been empty wilderness before Pike Farm. It had been a functioning community, then a shrinking one, then a name gradually removed from common use. Mara resisted the temptation to make the story cleaner than the evidence allowed. Some families had sold willingly. Others had faced debt, declining work, and limited choices. Surface parcels had consolidated over time. Mineral rights had remained fragmented among descendants. The disappearance of Vale Hollow had not been one crime or one day. Its erasure had happened slowly enough that later generations could mistake silence for emptiness. A local historical display took shape in one room of the county collection. It was modest, not grand. There was no dramatic excavation, no reconstructed underground town, and no attempt to turn the buried remains into entertainment. Instead, visitors would see the old photograph of Vale School, names from tax rolls, Lydia's words, Samuel's acquisition ledger, and maps showing how small tracts became part of the modern farm while subsurface interests followed different legal paths. Daniel produced the most important image, a clean overlay with two labels. Across the present-day parcel, he wrote, Pike Farm Present Surface. Beneath it, following the older roads and building footprints, he wrote, Vale Hollow Historical Footprint. Mara stood beside him when he printed the final version. "That's it," she said. Daniel looked at the page. Both fit, that's what I mean. Neither map canceled the other. The Pike family had a real history on the land. Vale Hollow had a real history before it. One did not have to become false for the other to be acknowledged. Daniel rolled the print carefully. Your grandfather would probably have corrected 3 labels, at least, and complained about the scale. Definitely. They both laughed. The work also gave Mara something she had not expected. A preservation architect who consulted with the historical collection needed drafting help, documenting older buildings in the county. Daniel mentioned Mara's background, and within days, she was offered contract work preparing measured drawings and record plans. The first assignment paid far less than the Harrow Ridge offer she had rejected. But when Mara opened the files and saw old dimensions, altered walls, and missing details that had to be reconstructed carefully, she thought of Samuel's note. A missing wall on a drawing does not prove the wall never stood. The work felt less like starting over than finding a different use for a skill she already had. Helen resisted visiting the Vale Hollow display. Mara invited her once, and did not ask again 2 weeks after the opening. Helen appeared anyway. She arrived late in the afternoon when the room was nearly empty. Mara saw her standing just inside the doorway, coat still buttoned, looking as though she might leave before anyone noticed. You came, Mara said. I said I didn't want to. You did. Apparently I was wrong. Mara did not push. They walked quietly past the maps and documents. Helen paused at Samuel's ledger but did not touch the case. She spent longer reading Lydia's testimony. Then she reached the enlarged school photograph. More than 50 people stood outside the wooden building, faces serious in the old camera exposure. The sign above them read, Vale School. Helen leaned closer. Samuel used to tell me Lydia hated having her picture taken. Mara looked at her. He told you that? Many times. Helen pointed toward a girl near one side of the group. He thought that was her. He was never completely sure. Mara studied the face. You never told me. There are a lot of things I stopped telling. Helen's voice softened. When I was little, he used to describe how Lydia said the children would stamp snow off their boots outside the school because the teacher hated mud on the floor. I thought he invented half of it because he wanted the place to feel alive. She looked at Lydia's testimony nearby. Maybe he didn't. Mara did not tell her mother she should have listened sooner. She understood now that Helen's distance had been its own kind of inheritance, shaped by years of feeling trapped inside losses she could not repair. Helen had wanted freedom from Samuel's backward-looking grief. Samuel had wanted protection against forgetting. Neither had known how to carry both. You don't have to love what he did, Mara said. Helen looked at the display. I don't. Then, after a moment, she added, but I understand it better. That was enough, near the center of the exhibit, beneath Daniel's overlay. Mara had placed one sentence from Samuel's final memorandum. Ownership was never the purpose. The ability to prevent erasure was. Visitors often stopped there longest. Some recognized family surnames from the old tax lists. Others pointed out roads their grandparents had mentioned. Owen came once, stood in front of the map, and quietly showed Mara where his father had taught him to repair a fence line that crossed directly over the old settlement road. Same ground, he said. Different memory. Mara nodded. Exactly. Nothing was taken from him. Pike Farm remained his home and working property. Nothing was given away by Mara either. The mineral rights still had genuine financial value, and she refused to treat money as morally unimportant simply because the inheritance carried history. If a future lease or transfer ever made sense, it would be considered carefully, with documented protections and knowledge of what lay beneath the surface. Samuel had not preserved the rights, so Mara would never use them. He had preserved them so she would have enough leverage to choose with full knowledge rather than surrendering control before anyone bothered to look. Months earlier, Mara had thought inheritance meant receiving something visible: a house, acreage, a vehicle, money in an account. At 19, sitting in an attorney's office, she had been almost embarrassed to learn that Samuel had left her rights beneath somebody else's farm. She had spent 18 years believing he had given her the least useful part of an old property dispute. At 37, she finally understood the design. He had left her no farmhouse because the farmhouse was never the point. He had left her no surface because the surface belonged to someone else. What he had preserved was enough legal power beneath the ground to ensure that if anyone someday wanted to change what lay there, somebody still had the right to ask what would be lost. On the wall of the historical collection, Daniel's final map showed Pike Farm in clear modern lines. Beneath it, Vale Hollow appeared again: the road, the school, the residential row, the old parcels. The name stretching across a place that newer maps had stopped naming. Mara stood in front of it one evening after the room had emptied. For most of her life, she had thought Samuel cared too much about things that no longer existed. Now she knew existence was not the same as visibility, and disappearance from a record was not the same as never having been there. Samuel had not left her a buried fortune. He had left her the right to prevent a buried history from vanishing without resistance. And after generations of shrinking deeds, forgotten names, lost buildings, and maps that had slowly become simpler, Vale Hollow was finally on the map again.